Hello, everybody. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Welcome to ICC's recap of the Tata Steels Masters tournament in Praggnanandhaa in the Netherlands. Today, I bring you rounds 9 through 10, which might seem like a short video, but there was a lot of blood spilled in just these 2 days. And in fact, in general, it's been a great tournament for the spectators because, just a lot of decisive games and very, very few short draws. Round 9 was probably very important round for the ultimate finish in the tournament because Carlsen really cemented his leader status by beating Mamedyarov, who had been hot on his heels on a good run up to that point. But Mamedyarov, maybe he has trouble playing against Carlsen. He wouldn't be the only one. And this was not a good day for him. So let's have a look at it. Carlsen is turning the Catalan into a very good weapon. And he's used it, pretty much exclusively throughout the tournament with good success. This being his 3rd win, and they've all been different. He's faced knight c6, he's faced the standard bishop e7 castles treatment, and Mamedyarov plays bishop check followed by a5. And e3. E3 is another one of those moves that's kind of way down on the list, something like the 5th most common move. And I've noticed that's a thing that Magnus does. I think probably he purposely tries to find the move that's not the most popular one, and maybe the opponent hasn't looked at as quite as carefully as other moves. Against Rapport, I think that the move was bishop to e3 in that position. Here it's pawn to e3. And there's a certain logic to the move that you can see in that the knight might be coming to e5. For instance, if b5, the knight can come to e5. And in that case, the pawn on d4 is defended. After e3, the game starts to go into new channels pretty quickly with the move rook a6. Just getting off the bishop diagonal and kind of grimly holding on to that pawn. And so Magnus said, okay, you can protect that pawn, but I've got this strong center, and black position is not all that well coordinated. Still, though, there aren't really any threats from white at this point. So, normal move might be h6. Rook fd1, and okay, the game slows down a little bit, knight d7, and white might even play just simply h3 to cover the g4 square, and then put the bishop on e3. And so white has this nice looking position, but it's not so easy to create something tangible for the sacrificed pawn. On the other hand, it's not that easy for black to move forward either. But the game quickly goes south for Mamedyarov. He starts with the move bishop e7, which does enable the b pawn to come forward. Also, I guess, provides an idea of knight a6 to b4. If that black knight can get into a good square, that would really help. But now came some tactics. e5. And white could have taken on b5 first, but perhaps the knight would go to a different square. And again, there's a move order issue because knight takes d5 is possible and grab the exchange like this. But the issue there is that now black has this solid foundation in the center of these pawns, and the position is more blocked. Maybe black just goes b4, and that would probably be more compensation for the exchange than black got in the game. But after a takes b5, knight b4 was possible. I think a computer even says equalizing, although it's very complicated. But Mamedyarov did not go for that. He simply recaptured. And now he finds himself in a position down the exchange. And he does have this impressive phalanx of pawns on the queen side. But there is a problem. This is d5 pawn is the weak link and potentially attackable. And rook a8 is a nice start. Important rule of thumb in positions where one side is up the exchange, or sometimes even rook playing against two minor pieces. The side with the extra rook really wants to trade a pair of rooks, because the two rooks don't necessarily help that much more than one, but that one last rook that your opponent has, you get rid of that. That's really very helpful. So this rook on a8 is a very annoying move. Mamedyarov plays h6, which is, generically helpful, but rook comes to a1. And he didn't find anything better than bishop e6. And now white has that exchange of rooks in his pocket if he wants. A problem was that if he would take the pawn on d4, white would trade and play rook d1 and take the pawn on d5. And black might win a pawn in that transaction, but the white pieces would become stronger. So he did not take the pawn, but now white simply defends that pawn. And what to do for black? Okay, b4. And then Carlsen plays like the engine. He goes b3. He stops those pawns. Black can make a protected pass pawn with c3, but it's pretty blocked up. Drives the queen off of d4, and now he reroutes the knight. The knight may be coming to c2 and e3 to attack the pawn on d5. So black has nice looking pawns on the queen side. They're not really doing all that much. And it quickly goes from bad to worse with the move f6. And the problem with that is that black is undermining the protection of his bishop and effectively pinning his knight, because if he takes the pawn, he runs into rook takes e6, runs into this tactic, and the knight on e6 is going to fall. That did not help, because again, the bishop gets taken. And here, Mamedyarov gave up. He can play knight d3 or bishop g5. They're actually kind of similar. White would just take the knight. Black can make a queen. Doesn't live long. You can see this position. White with these massive pawns, and they're going to be pretty much unstoppable. There's really, and the black king is even kind of hemmed in. Pretty much a zero chance that black has of holding this ending, for starters. So that was a huge win. Carlsen and Mamedyarov went into the round tied, and Carlsen took a point lead there. So after this round, Carlsen's closest pursuer became Anish Giri, and he won against Sam Shankland. Remember, Giri had that forfeit win over Dubov earlier, and it's really kind of jump-started him after a slow start, lots of draws and a loss to Carlsen. Giri has gotten into gear. This was a very strange game, though, very strange game. And you will see that too. King's Indian attack. And Shankland plays a system, including these captures, that not only he's played before, but Anish Giri has played this position with black as well. And I don't know if there's a little psychology involved, but it did not work out well for Shankland at all. Rook e1. And now bishop h6 is a new move, looking to trade off pieces. Maybe technically that is black's bad bishop because of the pawn on e5. But now he trades off this bishop, and it may seem on the surface like a good idea to play knight against bishop. The position is a little bit closed. But now white gets something on the light squares. The engine here suggested a5, at least for a while, but to prevent b4 and queenside expansion. But bishop d1 would be an interesting idea, looking to come out here and pressure the black pawns. I don't know that black is really quite equal here, and Sam went for this maneuver to try to trade off the knights, which seems like it would take some pressure off. But Giri came up with a very nice idea, a very unusual idea of the rook coming up and attacking the f-pawn. And that was a little bit awkward for black. If rook f8, then bishop e6 would have been possible, transferring that bishop using the pin. So the knight is very passive on d8. It's a passive position for black. I don't know if he should throw an h5 or not. He could do that, or he could play something like rook e8 directly. And yeah, black has a passive position, but it's not really clear what white is going to do to try to break through here. But the rest of the game, it was just like totally out of control. Shankland started with d5, and this looks like a dubious move, although, perhaps there can be some compensation demonstrated from this position. But the follow-up just all went very bad for black. Knight f7 seems like maybe a good idea. Get the knight into the game. It needs some pieces. Got all his pieces on the back rank. Instead, he played king d6, and it just seems a little too quick to try to blockade with the king when the pieces aren't out. And the blockade really did not hold up after the move g4. If Shankland plays f4, the rook would come over. a5 is the only way to save the pawn. Rook b3. Now if king c5, bishop f1, and rook b5 check, just wins the pawn. But if the king goes back, d6 check, and then rook b6, and white penetrates very effectively. Note that if king c6, bishop g2 check, black can't block the diagonal. So that's how the moves g4, f4 played a big role in this variation. So Sam tried something very desperate looking, and he gave up this pawn, and then he's trying again for some kind of blockade with the knight, but it's just too many pawns. And Anish goes, attacks the queen side, and again, if a5, there's still similar ideas to break down the pawns with rook b3. But taking, this did not work at all. And a lot of things white can do. Rook a6 check is an accurate move. I was watching at the time, and I thought rook c6 might be a good technique. Takes. White can take and drive the king out this way, and then the bishop will come to support the pawn. Bishop g4 to h5 or d7 d8, and then put the pawn on the 7th, which will free the white king. And the black king can't do anything about these pawns. He has to stay near these pawns, but he can't take them either. So separated past pawns, I think that wins easily. But Giri did was even cleaner. He played f6, takes, and it looks like black is getting a little something with this move, but the very nice concluding move, rook c6. And the only really hope for black would be to push this pawn, but then white can trade, and he's going to queen the f-pawn with check. Yeah, so if black cannot take on c4, if he needs to run away with the rook, then white can play b takes c4, and he's got a bunch of passed pawns that are going to be totally decisive. So a big win for Giri, and just a strange day for Shankland. Just didn't quite get it right at all. There were a couple of other decisive games. One was Praggnanandhaa against Karjakin, and in that game, the young Indian actually came out pretty hard, and then we see perseverance, a lot of perseverance from Karjakin to try to get the win, and a very plausible blunder eventually from Praggnanandhaa, and I'll explain that. So bishop f4. This is one of those systems that is often played by players who don't want any tactics. But at the grandmaster level, it's just often played by people who just want some kind of game, not all about theory. Even so, every line has been explored, and so has this one, knight h5. Karjakin, sees this as an opportunity to get moving in the tournament, so he sacrifices this pawn. And so around here, we're finally in new territory. But this is really very interesting, h4, instead of just simply castling kingside and playing with an extra pawn against the bishop pair. Very, very bold way to play, but possibly trying to accentuate what he's good at, against the veteran Karjakin. And this soon led to an exchange sacrifice. And Karjakin tried to get counterplay going on the queen side to distract white from operations on the other side. And here, this move, rook takes h5, allows bishop takes d4. The computer says the position is equal after king d2. Well, I guess the idea is that black is going to be reluctant to give up this bishop if he can't trade queens, because then his king is completely undefended against the g file and dark square attack. But after rook takes h5, black is able to simplify, which is not to say that he's winning the game, but at least he can, perhaps play for a win in the long term. And so it looks like white is holding, but Karjakin decides to make a push for it with h5, sacrificing that pawn to try to get going in the middle. And so now white looks for counterplay. And this is a huge moment in the game, because the move c6 is actually a tragic blunder. In computer terms, it's like a -3 or 4 move, which is really kind of shocking, because it's natural. I mean, if you watching this game and you would play c6, it's very understandable. I'll try to explain it this way. White pushes the c pawn. It's actually, when black breaks through in the center, the c pawn is just going to be a target for termination. The rook is just going to attack it. So h6 is the right move, creating a diversion over there. Now black goes after the h pawn, then you can push the c pawn. If black plays this e5 idea, like in the game, white actually has many drawing moves. For instance, knight d6. And one of the ideas is the knight can sacrifice itself for the pawn. The king can come up and support the c pawn, which it's close to. And it zeroes out. It's it's a little bit complicated, but that's the basic explanation of why h6 would succeed and c6 does not. Because now after e5, black is suddenly just winning. So Karjakin is rewarded for pressing that beginning with the h5, king d1. Well, if white plays c7, then black will be pushing through in the center, and the pawn on c7 doesn't really save white, because the pawn will come through to d3, and eventually black can move the rook over to an open file and threaten to come down with the mate, and the c pawn is not going to slow black down from doing that. So he gave up the pawn. And that was an interesting moment, because it turns out king d3 is the only winning move. But it is certainly a winning move. And it just makes sure that the pawns are slowed down. It certainly gets the king out of the way of a potential check on f5. And Karjakin plays this very simply. He doesn't even think about his d pawn for a while. He just systematically removes the white pawns. I mean, I think that black can win this in many different ways, but he just went about getting rid of that h pawn which he succeeded in doing here. H7, rook h6 check, and that's that. So Karjakin gets the win. He moves above 50%, and starting to make something of his tournament. The final decisive game of the round was Grandelius against Caruana. I said, and I think in my first video, I said that Caruana seemed to be in world championship match mode, playing for very small advantages. He's been playing with utter desperation after that, really taking lots of lots of chances. And in this game, I wouldn't say that that his opening is necessarily chancy, but in playing the French, he shows that he's really up for a fight. He doesn't want to equalize. He's willing to provoke Grandelius a little bit to try to get a win against the low man in the cross table, and it eventually pays off. I'm really going to focus most on what happens late in this game. I believe up until a5, Caruana had actually had this position once before. So my good friend John Fedorovich used to say about these positions that the players play alone. Black is looking to get the queen side going. White wants to do something on the king side. And so, it looks like white is getting something going there, but at the cost of this pawn. Now it was possible to play knight c6, bishop takes h6. Black has this defense. Whether that was better than what Caruana did, I think, Caruana, wanted to go for something he felt was, simpler defense, which really makes a lot of sense. Forces white to trade that knight. And now queen f7 would run into knight takes f4, queen takes f4, and bishop g5, and that costs a piece. So that the queen is now seeing its way to the e-pawn. And that basically forces black to take this. Now white has a dangerous pass pawn too. The queen c3 was the wrong move. The winning move is queen b5, d7. But this was not easy to see because now very strong for black is queen d5. And that's a move that it wouldn't necessarily consider because it allows rook e8 check. Now all these checks around the king are guarded, so the king is secure. And then you push the pawn can't be stopped. So that was the win for Caruana. But like I said, it's not so obvious, and both players were getting short of time. After queen c3, rook c1 is apparently good enough for a draw. If d2, white can even take the queen or simply play rook d1, and there's a good chance that there'll be simplification of the past pawns. But the move rook d1, now black is winning. And with a2, black is just too fast. White can take and make a queen, so he's first to make a queen. But the problem is, two passed pawns in the 7th rank can only be stopped by a rook on the 1st rank, and the rook can't get back. So that pawn got to a2, it's basically over. Queen e1. And now d2 gets the biggest computer score, but queen e2 as played is maybe the simplest. Just basically forcing the queens off, king g2. And now it's really a good time for a cleanup move. Rook d8 was certainly one of them, but king h7 getting off the back rank so pawn doesn't queen the check. That's a strong move. Grandelius tried to trade. And he gets rid of that pesky e-pawn, but now rook a7, rook behind the pawn. And if white goes after the pawn, black will just simply break his king out and eat the pawns on the king side. So it's a routine win here in the rook and pawn ending. So Caruana getting a win there, but we see that he won't be able to enjoy the prosperity for long, whereas Grandelius is going to bounce back. All right, so we move on to round 10. And this was a round where we saw some draws among the leaders. Karjakin played white against Carlsen, and he wanted no part of Magnus, steered the game into a boring draw from a Berlin defense. And they, contrived a repetition, after 15 moves. So Carlsen has a couple of draws like that with the black pieces. Well, not quite like that, but most of his games have been very, very fighting. Karjakin decided to just consolidate his position and not try to win the tournament. Okay, that's his call. In the game Giri against Duda, if anything, black had a little bit more of the pressure in that game. Giri had triple pawns for most of it, but eventually that kind of liquidated a bit and ended in perpetual check. Shankland against Mamedyarov. Mamedyarov repeated the same Catalan line he played against Carlsen. Shankland varied, but the game eventually balanced out and they agreed to draw in the middle game. But the blood was all spilled a little bit down from that, except that the very important game in the standings was Vidit against Praggnanandhaa, the All India matchup, and this was a titanic struggle. We saw a couple of those in this round. Vidit came out hard, wanting to post a win, and Praggnanandhaa can expect that, being the youngest and I believe lowest rated player as well. Bishop g5. Now, against this move, as well as knight f3, black can simply take on c4 and play b6. It's possible here too, but Praggnanandhaa takes up the challenge with c5, as he did against Rapport. And in that game, white played queen to g3. But Vidit plays queen f3, which he has played before. And this very sharp game, yeah, there's still following theory. It's pretty much hard to get a completely new position, even with very sharp moves. And this has all been done. I believe actually Vidit had this this position before for quite a long time. I think rook d2 is the first new move. And now b4, chancy looking move, but he wants the e5 pawn. So white grabs a pawn, but his king position is a little bit shaky. And a5, this does not succeed in opening the a file, but the pawn comes to a4, creating a hook for the queen to penetrate. At various moments, I've seen the computer give a big edge to white, but I don't think that was ever really true in any of these positions. It was just very unclear, and it's the kind of position that white can get into a lot of trouble with one mistake, because his king is at issue here. And that's kind of what happened. He grabs his pawns, and now he's got two pawns, but now knight comes to a very good square. And queen h6 is apparently a very bad move. That white should play rook to b4, and then with best play, he has very good chances of holding off black's initiative and using his extra material. But this move was, well, I don't know that's even greedy, because it allows black to take this pawn. And that gives, getting rid of that pawn gives black a lot of extra squares to play with. Now it's black that is probably winning, that his attack is too strong. A4 is recommended by the computer. It does not look obvious, but I suppose that the queen needs to be driven away. And from here, there's a whole lot of missed opportunities. Rook A8 was apparently stronger. I think Rook A8 was again the best move. And here, White should have played Queen C4. And if Knight takes A4, then the move Queen C6, I think, forces a trade of queens. That's a nice kind of subtlety. There wasn't a lot of time on the clock. I think that Praggnanandhaa was a little bit shorter, but these last few moves they have to play before time control. And you know, it's a lot easier when you're sitting at home and you're looking at the engine readout. But this is a very, very complex position. Knight takes A4, Rook D2, Rook C8. Again, Praggnanandhaa was criticized for not playing Rook A8, but I think it's not so obvious that it's good to allow the pin. Rook A2, B5 is an effective move for black. For instance, if Queen takes, Knight C3 is a crushing move. Don't forget the Queen is defending that Rook. But Rook C8. And the reason why Rook C8 is not as good is because White has to sacrifice the queen. And there would have been chances to hold this. You know, possibly White can make a draw. Maybe this is very close to a fortress. I mean, there is that B pawn, but I don't know if that B pawn in itself is enough to win the game. The Rook and Knight can really stay protected with these kingside pawns. But, you know, it's move 40, and you know, Vidit didn't know if it was time to be that kind of desperate. He's actually even a pawn ahead at this moment, but he allows pieces to be maintained, and now Black continues to have the strong attack. Yeah, this is kind of a nice move, because if White takes the pawn on B5, then Queen. Oops, no, I didn't get quite there. Queen H8 check would be a killing move, and then the Rook penetrates. So it's kind of nice how taking the pawn, because the H pawn is missing, that creates that strong tactic. So now there was a lot of maneuvering around, and with Praggnanandhaa maintaining the advantage, and eventually he decides to simplify into a very favorable ending. At what point it was definitively winning, I'm not sure. You know, White does not allow Black decisive simplification. I mean, it feels like Black is on the verge of winning, but Praggnanandhaa put up a lot of resistance for a long time. Vidit, I said, put up resistance, and eventually Praggnanandhaa is able to simplify. The White king is very cut off. Okay, so I think he was you know, killing some time there, but eventually this is a bit of a zugzwang position. The king can't come back to B3 because of Rook C5. It can't go up because of Rook G1. So the Rook has to give ground, and then the king starts coming up. And again, as a zugzwang. It's nice, but it's rather simple. There's not many pieces on the board. And yeah, Rook F1 threatens Rook F5. Not King F5, Rook F6. But the king does ultimately cross over. Rook F5, I guess, is coming next. Black's just going to be 2 pawns up. So a long battle. But Praggnanandhaa gets his second win of the event, and a very bitter loss for Vidit, who you know, drops out of the top pursuers for first place. The next game, we're going to see Caruana. You know, it just isn't his tournament, and I think he just made a blunder in this game. He goes for the this floor Mykonos, which we saw usually see with d5, but c5 in this game. And when I was a teenager, this pawn sacrifice, which Caruana did not play, was all the rage. And white gets very nice dark squares. At the time, I didn't really understand it at all. I was a big pawn grubber. I'm not that way anymore. But Caruana plays d4, which is the other way. And then there's this move, queen f4, which is relatively rare, but a recent move. I think that Dubov has played it a few times. Actually, the move e takes d6, I think, is a novelty. Bishop d2 had been played by Dubov himself. But now they quickly go into an endgame. f5 is a move that I really like because the knight is getting ready to come back into the game to f7, but it also kills the knight's entry into the center with e4. I think that was quite a nice move. And bishop c5 is also a good move. And knight e5 is a fancy move, but not really that effective, giving this isolated pawn. But now black consolidates and starts throwing those kingside pawns forward. He's utilizing what he's got, the knight coming to this outpost on c5, but Rapport not really too concerned that he can't move pieces, can't move the bishop, not really worried about it for now. g4, confronting black on the king side. I don't know if that was the right strategy, but rook d4, I think this is an oversight. White could have protected that pawn with h3 or rook g1. But now after knight g4, bishop g4, e5, and black maintains this big kingside majority. What's really funny about this position is that black has a clear advantage, but no pieces developed, 0 pieces developed, but he's much better. Of course, it is, trending towards an end game. So now he develops rooks before bishops, as they say in the books. And white maintains material equality, but the bishop comes out and rook comes out. Black has this majority of pawns on the king side, which is very dangerous. And eventually, Caruana had no answer. I think that knight f4 maybe made things worse, as this pawn is able to advance. The tactical idea is always takes in h3, and the pawn pushes through with support of the bishop. Black uses forms of that tactics later. Rook d8, I think that this is the simplest. If knight takes h3, black, I think, will just take the pawn on h2 and win the knight for the pawn. He still has 2 pawns left. But after rook b2, bishop f3, threatening mate, he can't do anything about the pawn queening. So sad loss for Caruana. He was pressing. I mean, he didn't have anything. But I think that rook d4 was just a blunder. And I mean, the game wasn't over there. Kudos to Richard Rapport for nice technique. With that game, he moves to 6 points out of 10, which means that Carlsen has now defeated his 3 closest pursuers, Giri, Mamedyarov, and Rapport. And that's why he's in first place. That really helps when you can beat the guys who are doing well in the tournament and not so much beat up on the guys on the bottom. All right, let's move on to Esipenko against JVF, Jordan van Foreest. And this was also a strange game. I said that about Shankland, just like it seemed, like an unnecessary loss. That wasn't the kind of fight that he could have put up in the game. There wasn't much happening out of the opening in that game. but Van Foreest allowed Esipenko to dominate the F file and eventually invade into the position, and won the end game. And it was kind of strange how that transpired. In the final decisive game, Niels Grandelius, who the players are picking on even more than Praggnanandhaa, I think. They're really, especially Grandelius has a very enterprising style. They're looking for wins in those games, and Dubov played a very poor game, and Grandelius was able to win a very long one. Okay, so Esipenko Van Foreest. I mean, start out kind of quietly. You can say Esipenko maybe was playing for two results. Knight c3. Well, this is kind of old school. And this is one of those positions where surprisingly we get down to a new position pretty quickly. And this is actually a new move, bishop takes e3. Hard to believe. I think black usually takes on d5. But there doesn't seem to be anything wrong at all with Van Foreest, what Van Foreest does. Okay, so he decides to play f5, which I think is okay. He's being active. He can certainly hold the line on the king side. I don't think that white should really be able to achieve anything there, but it seems natural to play f5. And he takes with the rook. I think it makes more sense to capture with the bishop. c5, and perhaps even that move can be questioned. And then he strands his rook on g5 instead of trading. Of course, if he trades, he's not able to play rook f8 right away, because after rook takes f8, he'd have to take with a queen and the pawn would hang. But he could do something like queen d7, and I don't think that white really has that much with the f file. But instead, with the stranded rook on g5, Esipenko just played very patiently and never let Van Foreest take care of the situation in the f file. Or you could say Van Foreest just sort of let it go. And he has this demonstration on the queen side. But now white dominates in there. Bishop g8, I think that was a mistake. And rook e2 is not the strongest. Apparently g4 is the strongest, which is not that obvious. Queen takes d6 can be answered by bishop takes h3, I suppose, with the idea of following up with queen e1. That's, white has to watch out for that invasion. That's why he played rook e2, but apparently g4 is a strong move. After rook e2, black stayed in the game, although white won a pawn. And Van Foreest is putting up resistance. Until this moment. He needed to play queen g3 check. And the point is that when the king goes back, then you can go after the pawn. Let's say queen c3, or queen e3, because if the pawn pushes, you have a check to pick up the pawn. And if rook f3 like the game, you can play queen e2. And here's another key difference. if rook g3, that's actually a blunder because queen e1 check. So that was a nice subtlety. It was important to put the king on the back rank. But after queen c3, white gives back the pawn and wins with this move because h4 is nice timing, not allowing the queen to get back. And black has to play h5 to prevent the rook from being won by h5. And now he just drops all of his pawns. All he can do is wait. Esipenko tidies up and now grabs a couple of pawns. And the technique was not a problem for him. He forced the queens off. He now makes an even more outside pass pawn and two pass pawns. It's very routine. Then Foreest in this final position, he has to go one way or the other with the king, and whichever way he goes, the other side will be abandoned, and it will be easy for white to win that. So Esipenko getting a nice win over Van Foreest, but I do give Van Foreest credit. I think he's had something like 7 decisive games, so he doesn't draw much. He's always provides entertainment, and of course, defending champion. So this, I think he'll be a consistent participant in this tournament for the way he plays. So finally, we have Dubov against Grandelius, and I think Dubov took a lot of liberties in this game, and he paid for it. So by unusual move order, we end up in a Sicilian. And the standard kind of thing to do in this position is to play knight e4, and the white knight usually comes to d2 and trades, and then white hopes with the pawn at e5 to launch a kingside attack, much like the kind that Grandelius tried in the round before, and black plays on the queen side. But no, he goes check, and this has been played in a couple of games. Knight goes back, because now it can come to e7 without blocking the bishop. But now Dubov plays a new move, to say the least. Castles. And now Dubov is can be an electrifying player, and he's played some really fantastic games. I really enjoy his style, but sometimes sometimes it's too much. This is too much. I really think that that this only puts pressure on white, really, because white is hoping for some kind of storm on the king side, but black with that c-file just has a natural area of attack. Knight c6. This move, if anything, is probably a little bit inaccurate because the knight already serves a function on e7, potential to come to f5. But the bottom line is it's pretty easy to play the black position. Okay, he stops that pawn from getting to h6. And he's creating a lot of counterplay. If g5, knight b4 comes, and black is certainly okay there. But things got worse. Now g5, knight f5, it's not going to happen. But now queen side comes very fast. If you take the knight, d pawn takes, knight d5, big initiative. So this is not going well. The only thing is Grandelius is chewing up a lot of time, and you see it here already. He's starting to repeat moves. But rook c3, not a successful move. Black can play b5 here, but also what he did is just simple and very strong. Now it's one of those positions where you just want everything. You want something totally convincing, and Grandelius could not find it. As I said, he repeats a lot. Somewhere along the line, he could just play something like knight c6, maybe in this position. And I think that White's position will be overrun in a couple of moves. But Grandelius, who is not doing all that well in the tournament, and maybe not at a high confidence mode. So he takes the bird in the hand. He wins a pawn, but trades queens, and leads to a position that's probably drawable for white. In fact, according to the engines, knight takes a5 is pretty close to equal. And why would that be? I mean, black's queen side is massive, but the problem is that this pawn structure on the king side allows white to play f5 and get a very natural pawn play there. And that's always going to be hanging over black's head. He can't really activate his king without allowing lots of counterplay. So black would be very hard pressed to win that. After knight d2, b4, apparently c4 is also the best move. But now the center actually collapses. Knight b3, rook c4 check. White cannot allow the trade of rooks. So now he's really just kind of trying for tactics / cheapos. Rook c7, and then a5. Another way to do it was knight b5, looking to take this pawn on g4. It was very strong, but I think a5, he doesn't hurt anything. He runs with his a pawn. And apparently a2 was the stronger move, not allowing white to get this, the defense that he set up in the game with a knight coming over. King c3, I think he can just simply play rook b4 and start grabbing the king side pawns, and that should be enough to win. But certainly this was tempting. It's kind of hard to believe that this isn't just an immediate knockout, and it could have been, I think, rook c6 check, and then the d pawn gets ready to run. But somehow this is not over, and in fact, rook takes a6. This might have been a better chance, and then take the pawn on e6. You get the pawn on e6, the pawn on a2. And black could get f4 and g4, but the white king comes over, and that white has substantial drawing chances there. But to knight c2, he just gave up the knight, and this should be lost. But surprisingly, it's not that routine. It's one of those positions with a big number, but it's still not that routine. It's after rook f1. White kind of complicates things a bit with f6. And this is most certainly winning for black. They've still got to win it. And this was an unfortunate move. Apparently, almost any other rook move wins, like rook e1. You can use the d pawn to get rolling, maybe as a decoy to win off the pawns. But rook f5 surprisingly let white back in the game, because the problem is that now the king can come up to e6 because it suddenly gets mated. That would really be a horrible way to finish the game. So he had to go back. But now white is actually getting in the realm of a draw against all odds. And I think that e6 would have been good enough, knight d6, and then stay off of the E and the F files. And white has a very good chance of winning this pawn, this H pawn, and then black may have to give up his pawns to get the give up his H pawn to get rid of the two pawns. Then rook and knight against rook should be a draw. So Dubov actually managed to battle back to what looked like a draw, but after king f4, knight h8. It's always great when the killer move is knight retreating to h8. But it's coming out to g6, and then suddenly white cannot hold this position anymore. He loses his pawn. And then he concludes by rerouting the knight again in the other way back to f7, and this basically traps the rook. He has to either trade now or rook h7, king g8. So Grandelius was able to overcome resistance, 82 moves, coupled with that Praggnanandhaa win in 78. Some real titanic struggles. There are lots of big swings in this game, as befit these games where everything is finished in one session. You didn't have this kind of excitement in the old days of the adjournments. Okay, so in those 2 rounds, we had 8 decisive games. Really, lots of action. I thought like, hey, 2 rounds, how many games am I gonna want to show? But it was really an amazing round. Carlsen in the lead with 7, Giri 6.5, Mamedyarov and Rapport have 6. A few players on 5.5. Arjun continues to lead the B group. I believe last looked he had 8.5 out of 10 monster score, and almost certainly we're going to see him in the A group next year. All right, the tournament continues. There's 3 more rounds, and I will have another recap after those games to finish off the action from the Tata Steels Masters in, if I can say, Netherlands. Thanks for joining me. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, and look to see you again for the next video.